Haven't checked. The guy walking the dog earlier passed by and had a conversation with one of the women outside the Unitarian Church of Montreal who were working to clean up the garden somewhat. This woman that we see here, I spoke with her for several minutes, and I wasn't, totally sure what it was about, but suspected it might well have been about my protest here. So thought he might possibly try to get my side of the story, but apparently not. So I'll just continue to circulate here. So I got 3 chalk slogans down and carrying a couple of picket signs, but I'm not displaying the freestanding ones because it's quite windy. I think it's actually going to rain. I don't know how long these chalk slogans are going to last, but yes, Unitarians, also known as Unitarian Universalists, do in fact cover up and deny child sexual abuse committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers, Unitarian Universalist Sunday school teachers, and yes, the occasional Unitarian Universalist layperson as well. So they unfortunately not only try to conceal it, but even outright deny it, even when they know that it has in fact occurred. And perhaps one of the most egregious examples of Unitarian Universalists outright denying child sex abuse committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers is the brazen, bald-faced lie that recently deceased UUA moderator Jim Key inserted into the middle of his essentially mendacious and highly misleading and thus utterly worthless UUA board apology to victims of clergy sexual misconduct that was delivered to thousands of Unitarian Universalist delegates at the 2014 General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Jim Key sandwiched into the middle of his first moderator's report to a Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly what was supposed to be a second UUA apology to victims of Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, because the first apology had proven to be worthless, and which was more specifically a UUA board apology to victims of clergy sexual misconduct. And in this so-called apology, which can basically, denied and minimize the extent and seriousness of clergy sexual misconduct. On the one hand, it admitted that there were cases of clergy sexual misconduct and expressed regret for them, but on the other hand, it pretended that there was only a few, and so on and so forth, and it really minimized the thing. But anyway, in the middle of that, he said the following words: there were no incidents of abuse of children or elders in my investigations. So, he essentially said, I have personally investigated clergy sexual misconduct, and in my own personal investigation of Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, I found no evidence of any sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist ministers. That's what there were no incidents of abuse of children or elders in my investigations means. Unless, of course, he meant that he personally didn't abuse any children or elders while he was investigating clergy sexual misconduct. I mean, that's another way it could be interpreted, but I don't think that's what he actually meant. So essentially he said, I investigated clergy sexual misconduct, clergy sexual abuse, and I found no evidence of any sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist ministers in my investigations. Well, this was a brazen, bald-faced lie on the part of UUA moderator Jim Key, if only because I personally told Jim Key about cases of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape committed by certain Unitarian Universalist ministers, where the ministers in question were charged, tried, and convicted, sentenced to jail terms, and actually spent some years in jail for their sexual abuse of children. And this was part of my efforts to persuade UUA moderator Jim Key and the UUA Board of Trustees that they needed to ensure that the Unitarian Universalist Association formally withdrew its false blasphemous libel accusation, publicly apologized for its false blasphemous libel accusation, publicly disclosed exactly how many Unitarian Universalist ministers are in fact guilty of committing such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. And while they're at it, they might as well also identify how many Unitarian Universalist Sunday school teachers are guilty of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape as well. So this was all part of trying to persuade Jim Key to do his job, which is to ensure that the administration of the Unitarian Universalist Association is, conducting itself in a manner that is in alignment with the claimed principles and purposes of Unitarian Universalism. But of course he refused to do so, and proceeded to outright lie about sexual abuse of children. Because like I said, at rock bottom minimum, I told him about a few cases, and he could have verified what I told him. And in fact, if he'd continued his conversations with me instead of breaking off communication, I actually could have told him about a few cases that I hadn't actually even brought up in my initial communications with him. I told him about a few cases, but I could have actually told him more than I actually did. But he broke off communication, so that was that. So anyway, Jim Key was certainly told by me about the rape of teenage Tibetan refugees by Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell in the early 1990s. Well, actually, it probably started in the mid to late 1980s, but he was, charged, tried, and convicted of the forcible rape of teenage Tibetan refugees in the early 1990s. I believe it was 1991 or 1992, that he was actually convicted of these crimes, despicable crimes, if I can borrow Maitre Marc-André Coulombe's words. And I also told him that there were some cases of actual pedophilia, actual sexual abuse of very young children by Unitarian Universalist ministers, where the ministers in question were charged, tried, and convicted and sentenced to jail terms. That should have been enough for him to avoid pretending that there was no sexual abuse of children whatsoever amongst Unitarian Universalist clergy, as his brazen, bald-faced lies either states or suggests. He didn't outright say, there hasn't been any sexual abuse of children. Specifically, what he said is, I investigated it and I didn't find any evidence of this. So he sort of covered his ass a little bit by, if some cases had come up, he said, I wasn't aware of that kind of thing, what's it called? Plausible deniability or whatever, So he didn't claim exactly that there had never been any cases of sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist ministers, but he certainly suggested it in saying that he had investigated clergy sexual misconduct and hadn't found any evidence of any sexual abuse of children. So weasel words, and effectively an outright lie, because as I said, I personally told him about several cases of sexual abuse of children, and I can't imagine, I can imagine that I'm the only one, because I know how even, the most prominent advocates for victims of clergy sexual misconduct, people like Reverend Gail Seavey, people like Reverend Deborah Pope Lance, can't seem to bring themselves to speak openly about sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist ministers. Reverend Gail Seavey and Deborah Pope Lance are very aware of the fact that a certain number of children have in fact been sexually abused by a certain number of Unitarian Universalist ministers, and yet you very rarely, if ever, see them speaking about this. You know, and even when they do speak about the Reverend Mac Mitchell case, they speak about it in such you know, couched terms, like they don't even name him. You know, they're afraid to even name Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell, a guy who was charged, tried, and convicted of forcible rape and indeed unnatural rape, you can figure out what that is, of teenage Tibetan refugees. You know, and they can't even like speak openly about that case, you know, name the guy and say specifically what he was convicted of and so on. You know, so these are the most prominent you know, advocates for victims of, or were anyway. I think really they're more on the side of the institution than the victims. You know, they're more interested in protecting their religious community from the negative fallout of clergy sexual misconduct than really caring about the victims themselves, based on what I've seen in recent years. So anyway, we'll continue to circulate here. The wind seems to have died down, so I may actually display some of the freestanding picket signs. Oh, is that the Charles Edis? Yes, it looks like it could be Charles Edis. Oh, maybe not, maybe not. No, it's not Charles Edis. It's a guy by the name of John. I thought it was Charles Edis and his wife, but nope. Charles Edis walks with a cane these days, when he walks at all. So it wasn't him, but you know, from a distance, especially with a certain amount of astigmatism, I thought it might be him. It looked like it could have been Charles Edis with his wife Nancy Edis approaching the church. They do that on occasion. So anyway, here we have someone engaged in the action in the world of weeding the garden of the Unitarian Church of Montreal. But this very same person isn't really interested in weeding her religious community of pedophiles and rapists and people who cover up and deny pedophilia and rape. No, she's happy to let those weeds stick around and even proliferate. As are, you know, most other Unitarian Universalists who ignore my protest and who ignore my blog posts, who ignore my tweets and so on. They're all complicit in the injustices and abuses that I am exposing and denouncing. So if only they, you know, devoted as much effort to weeding out the pedophiles and rapists and their enablers who don't do enough to hold them accountable from their religious community, you know, it would be so much better. But they can weed out actual weeds, but they can't weed out figurative weeds. So anyhow, all very metaphorical there. But it's actually a very good metaphor, you know, because you know, when you have a garden and you have weeds in the garden, and those weeds are basically making it you know, difficult for the garden to grow properly, you get rid of the weeds. But when it comes to clergy sexual misconduct, also known as clergy sexual abuse, and indeed when it comes to non-sexual clergy misconduct and non-sexual forms of clergy abuse, you know, verbal abuse, psychological abuse, and so on. Unitarian Universalists do not weed their rather weedy garden. As I said, a minimum of 40% of Unitarian Universalist Association congregations have been affected by, oh, here we go, the person reading the, alright. So we got a person trying to read my chalk slogans. What do we got here? Anyone recognizable? It's probably not a good idea to park in the middle of the Maisonneuve Boulevard and cross the bicycle path. There's better ways to approach the church. Safer ways to approach. Socks. 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 Yeah. Socks. Yeah. Socks. Socks. Yeah. Yeah. English. English. Yeah. Yeah. Unitarian. Unitarian. Yeah.
Unitarian.
Clergy.
Clergy.
Yeah. Abuse. Yeah. Unitarian.
Unitarian.
Yeah. Clergy. Clergy. Sometimes it's sometimes it's but today it's with this word it's G. G.
Clergy.
Wait. Abuse. Yes.
Abuse.
Yes. Sucks. Sucks.
萨克斯就是萨克斯说吹。
Yeah, sucks. Yeah.
这个呢，abuse 是啊。
Abuse. Yeah. Yeah, like hitting people. Yeah. Abuse. Yeah.
Abuse.
Just a minute, I'm gonna fix this. So this woman has tried reading my tickets, my chalk slogans in the past. Her English is, she's learning English, and this is an interesting little exercise.